Have you ever wondered how a single individual could so completely capture the attention of an entire nation, becoming the face of Sunday night television for 2 whole decades, yet remain remarkably reserved and even awkward off camera? Let's plunge into the unforgettable story of Ed Sullivan, the man once known as the king of variety, whose far-reaching influence was felt by countless performers and viewers alike. From the earliest days of his life in a culturally rich neighborhood in New York City to the countless legendary acts he introduced to American living rooms, Ed Sullivan's existence was anything but ordinary. For 23 remarkable years, he reigned over television's most iconic variety program, welcoming some 10,000 performers onto his stage and creating history with every broadcast. Ed Sullivan guided talents such as Elvis Presley, the Beatles, Woody Allen, Jackie Mason, Phyllis Diller, Rowan and Martin, and so many others to national exposure. His show played a decisive role in shaping the entertainment landscape of mid-century America, and in turn, influenced generations of viewers who gathered around their TV sets each Sunday. Yet behind the scenes lay a man whose personal life was every bit as unusual and dramatic as his presence in the public eye. Someone who courted friends and enemies in equal measure, who feuded with heavy hitters such as Frank Sinatra and Steve Allen, and who steadfastly insisted upon breaking down color barriers on television, even when his own sponsors balked. How did such an unassuming figure become so powerful in entertainment? And why did his own story end in such a bittersweet manner? Prepare to find out as we traverse through his early upbringing, his initial forays into journalism and radio, and the momentous pivot that birthed Toast of the Town, better known as the Ed Sullivan Show. Along the way, we'll explore the cultural shifts that turned this once novel medium into a fundamental piece of the American experience. We'll consider the complicated interactions between sponsors and performers, and we'll even explore the speculations surrounding his curious personality. By the end, you'll discover why Ed Sullivan's legacy endures as both a testament to and a product of one of the most transformative eras in modern entertainment. Stick around to the finale, where we'll glance forward to how his legacy gave rise to future broadcasting giants, and how a man who some called a non-host gave us some of the purest, most unadulterated performances the country had ever witnessed. Now let's unravel his journey in detail. The Ed Sullivan we remember as the unwavering Sunday night presence was born in a culturally vibrant area of New York City at a time when Irish and Jewish families lived side by side, shaping the entire atmosphere of the neighborhood in which he grew up. Sullivan's father, Peter, hailed from an Irish immigrant family, and this heritage played a significant role in Ed's formative years. He also inherited an artistic dimension from his mother, Elizabeth, who was an amateur painter. The couple had twins, Ed and his brother Danny, but life took a sorrowful turn early on as Danny passed away before reaching his first birthday. The immediate family eventually relocated to Port Chester when Ed was just 5 years old. There, he experienced a variety of influences: the immersive music and ritual of the Catholic Church, the old-world charm of horse-drawn carriages morphing into the hum of the automobile age, and the subtle blend of cultures that led him to believe in the power of shared experiences, a belief that would someday feed into his mission to bring diverse talents under one roof on national television. Throughout his childhood, Ed stood out as a hard-working student at St. Mary's High School in Port Chester. He made a name for himself by diving into the school newspaper and engaging wholeheartedly in multiple sports, earning letters in several of them. His scholastic and athletic prowess could have given him a strong launching pad for college, but instead, he made a decision that would alter his entire life's path. Following in his father's footsteps, he embraced journalism, setting aside any higher education ambitions. One can only imagine the swirl of influences behind this choice in the late 1910s. America was in the midst of change after World War I, and mass communication was evolving rapidly. Perhaps Ed sensed that shaping stories and delivering the news was a direct route to connecting people, satisfying that deep urge to unite audiences that he harbored from boyhood. At first, his journey in journalism was far from stable. He hopped around from one publication to another in quick succession, starting as a reporter for the Port Chester Daily Item in 1918, then switching to the Hartford Post in 1919, followed by the New York Evening Mail in 1920. Once the Evening Mail folded, he bounced among various papers in New York and Philadelphia, trying to find a permanent place to exercise his own style of reporting. During these years, America was embracing the Jazz Age, an era brimming with speakeasies, flappers, and the radical changes that the Roaring Twenties brought to culture and entertainment. Print media was an especially powerful force. Radio was on the rise, but still in its nascent stage, and the concept of television, as we would know it, had yet to make any mainstream splash. Sullivan, pivoting between these jobs, was gradually cultivating a style that combined show business insights with sports coverage, local happenings, and a generous sprinkling of personal observations. His pivotal encounter with Walter Winchell came during his tenure as sports editor at the New York Evening Graphic. Winchell was famous at the time for his gossip column, which was widely read and carried immense influence. Gossip columns had enormous power. These were the days before the internet, before instant viral hashtags, when the press literally shaped public perception by deciding whose names would grace the headlines. Sullivan, observant as ever, saw in Winchell a template for how a journalist could not just report, but define the conversation, transcending the conventional boundaries between news and commentary. Yearning for that same level of recognition and hold over public sentiment, Sullivan stepped into Winchell's shoes when Winchell left for the New York Mirror in 1931. However, the Graphic shut down soon after, leaving Ed's career once again precarious. This pattern of being on a sinking ship repeatedly threatened to force him into abrupt professional transitions, which could have easily derailed a less determined personality. In 1932, fate handed Sullivan a new path. He began writing his little old New York column for the New York Daily News, a platform he would maintain until his death. Steady journalism gigs, especially in a major city like New York, were prized positions, so finding this more stable perch must have felt like a triumphant breakthrough after years of volatility. Despite a pay cut, Sullivan set about expanding his horizons, taking on radio interview shows with both NBC and CBS. His reputation was growing. With an already recognizable name, he was in a prime position to bring new talent to the airwaves. For instance, in 1932, he introduced Jack Benny, who would become a legendary figure of comedic radio and television, as the first radio entertainer on WABC, a CBS affiliate. Going even further, Sullivan hosted his own radio program, Ed Sullivan Entertains, from 1936 to 1952. Radio was a remarkable stepping stone for Ed's show business aspirations. During the Great Depression era and well into World War II, radio was the reigning medium for entertainment. Large families would gather around the console to listen to comedians' dramas and music performances, forging a communal experience that transcended social and economic barriers. One can only assume that watching the success of radio, Sullivan got an early taste of how mesmerizing mass communication could be. He also acted as a theater master of ceremonies at the Paramount and Loew's state theaters, ensuring his public persona was tied to live performance, stage shows, and the living pulse of New York's cultural nightlife. Theater at that time was still a premium form of entertainment, a direct holdover from vaudeville and the glamorous heyday of live variety shows. By 1947, a chance event at Madison Square Garden changed everything. Sullivan was hosting the Harvest Moon Ball, a dance contest and spectacle sponsored by the New York Daily News. The enormous audience, combined with Sullivan's ability to keep the night lively and engaging, captured the attention of advertising executive Marlo Lewis. It was a clarifying moment. Television was finally coming into its own after numerous years of technological development and the gradual expansion of broadcast networks in the aftermath of World War II. Many believed that TV would soon eclipse radio as America's primary source of entertainment, and Marlo Lewis saw in Ed Sullivan a figure who might help shape that transition. Sure enough, on June 20th, 1948, Sullivan hosted his first television show on CBS, then called Toast of the Town, with Emerson Radio as its sponsor. It was an instant success, bringing the flavor of vaudeville, comedy, variety acts, musical performances, directly into living rooms across the nation. Though Emerson Radio dropped its sponsorship, Lincoln Mercury stepped in, recognizing a golden opportunity. The show continued under Sullivan's stewardship and was soon renamed The Ed Sullivan Show. The basic formula remained the same for more than 20 years, an almost unprecedented run in TV history. The earliest broadcast featured a diverse range of acts: Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis, dancer Catherine Lee, pianist Eugene List, Rogers, and Hammerstein, and a dance troupe called the Totes. Even at this initial stage, one can see the eclectic mix of highbrow, middlebrow, and lowbrow entertainment that Ed strove to present. This bouncing act was essential. In a time when families of all backgrounds crowded around a single television set, it was crucial for shows to offer something for everyone. The brilliance of Sullivan's approach was to blend classical or theatrical performance with comedic bits or pop sensations in waiting, ensuring cross-generational appeal. Over time, the Ed Sullivan Show came to embody Sunday night itself. Competition existed. Other networks tried to replicate the variety format, and stars like Milton Berle, Sid Caesar, and Steve Allen captured their own loyal audiences. But Sullivan's program distinguished itself partly because of his personal style. He didn't overshadow the acts with boisterous banter, nor did he try to be a comedian in his own right. Instead, he had an almost humble approach to hosting, presenting the performers as the true headliners and making himself more of a guide than a star. Some found him awkward. For instance, his jerky movements and stiff mannerisms were rumored to have been influenced by medical treatments for a stomach ulcer. Modern-day viewers might find that style peculiar, especially compared to hosts who rely heavily on comedic monologues, flamboyant antics, or outwardly emotive personalities. But for many viewers of the 1950s and 60s, it gave Sullivan an aura of authenticity, setting him apart from performers who indulged in comedic or dramatic flourishes. At the same time, Sullivan displayed a razor-sharp instinct for what the mainstream American audience wanted, or might soon want. His so-called keen eye for talent selection was almost legendary. He was known to organize test audiences for prospective acts. If they failed to generate enthusiasm or seemed too esoteric, he would not hesitate to pull them off the docket for Sunday night TV. This was an era when there were far fewer channels, so a single primetime show had immense power in shaping the national conversation. Artists who made it onto Ed's stage could expect a quantum leap in their careers. Woody Allen, Jackie Mason, Phyllis Diller, Rowan and Martin, and countless others can trace at least part of their rise to the moment they stepped onto the Ed Sullivan stage. But two examples outshine almost every other: Elvis Presley and the Beatles. Originally, Sullivan balked at the idea of featuring Elvis Presley. Elvis's gyrating hip movements and the frenzy he caused among young fans seemed scandalous to Middle America and risked alienating older, more conservative viewers. Indeed, in a more modern sense, it's difficult to grasp just how radical Elvis appeared to that 1950s mainstream audience. Steve Allen, who was hosting a competing show, took a gamble on Elvis, and after witnessing the resulting surge in public excitement, Sullivan knew it would be foolish to ignore the phenomenon. So he secured a $50,000 contract with Presley's manager, Colonel Tom Parker, to have Elvis appear 3 times on the Ed Sullivan Show. The second and third appearances in particular were ratings explosions. By Elvis's third time on the show, the camera famously only filmed him from the waist up in response to an outcry about his shocking dance moves. This practice became legendary in television lore, a direct instance of how network standards tried to respond to the moral panic around rock and roll. Yet the controversy only made Presley all the more iconic and gave Sullivan's show an inescapable place in rock history. The other seminal moment, arguably just as influential, occurred on February 9, 1964, when the Beatles made their Ed Sullivan debut. With America still reeling from the tragic assassination of President John F. Kennedy just months prior, people were hungry for some kind of cultural spark or positive distraction. The Beatles were that spark. On that Sunday evening, a record-breaking 73 million people tuned in, constituting a massive share of the television audience. The mania was electric. The songs "I Want to Hold Your Hand," "She Loves You," and others were fresh, and their performance effectively launched what was soon dubbed the British invasion in American music. That single broadcast stands as one of the most watched events in television history at the time, and remains a pivotal cultural milestone. After that performance, the American music scene would never be the same, and Sullivan forever secured a unique place in pop culture lore as the host who introduced America to the Beatles. Behind the camera and away from the stage lights, Sullivan's personal life was a curious mix of glamour and detachment. He married Sylvia Weinstein on April 28, 1930, and the pair led what might be described as a whirlwind lifestyle, replete with luxury, artificial comforts, and a near-total absence of domestic routine. They lived in a suite at the Delmonico Hotel in Manhattan, rarely if ever cooking at home, always choosing restaurants or clubs for their meals. Their daughter, Elizabeth, nicknamed Betty, grew up in similarly unorthodox surroundings. She dined with a paid companion at restaurants until she was 12. There is a sense that all of them, Ed, Sylvia, and Betty, lived in a kind of perpetual show business bubble, outside the sphere of the typical American household. Yet such a lifestyle wasn't entirely uncommon among the top celebrities of the day, many of whom stayed in hotels for extended periods or hopped between residences in different states. Despite his role as a gracious host to thousands of performers, Sullivan wasn't immune to clashes and feuds with other big names. His run-ins with notable figures such as Walter Winchell, Steve Allen, Frank Sinatra, Jack Parr, Nat King Cole, and Arthur Godfrey illustrated that Sullivan could be either incredibly warm and generous or cold and dismissive, depending on the circumstances. In a particularly generous example, Sullivan once paid for the funeral of dancer Bill Bojangles Robinson, who had fallen on hard times. These episodes show a man brimming with contradictions, someone whose personal friendships could burn hot and bright, but who was also capable of bitterness toward those who had crossed him professionally. It suggests a certain steeliness in Sullivan, who knew that television, like journalism, was a rough arena where loyalty could be fleeting and competition could turn best friends into adversaries overnight. Another dimension of Sullivan's character that warrants close attention was his philanthropic spirit and his stance on social issues. During World War II, Sullivan decided to use his vast influence. He had his newspaper column, his radio shows, and eventually his television platform to produce 46 shows to raise funds for Army emergency relief. But even more notably, he was an advocate for racial equality during a period in which racial segregation and discrimination were still deeply embedded in American society. When sponsors urged him to drop African American acts to cater to a larger Southern audience, Sullivan refused. A testament to his unwavering beliefs, he even wrote an article in Ebony magazine in 1951, pointedly titled, "Can TV Crack America's Color Line?" He challenged the networks and audiences alike to confront the reality that black performers were systematically excluded or minimized. Later in the 1960s, he made history by adding an African American dancer to his chorus line, an unprecedented move for a major television program. Though the mainstream press might not always have highlighted these decisions, they underscore a moral conviction that Sullivan held, aligning with the broader civil rights movement that was gaining momentum at the same time. If he was awkward on stage, he was decisive in his support of equal opportunity, an attitude that likely cost him some ad sponsorship, but earned him immense respect from progressive viewers and performers. Meanwhile, Sullivan's remarkable run continued. Even as television was diversifying in the 1960s, with game shows, talk shows, and sitcoms proliferating, the Ed Sullivan Show remained Sunday night television's gold standard. It was the unstoppable juggernaut of variety entertainment. He welcomed a wide array of guests, from comedic legends to acrobatic troupes, from ventriloquists to the hottest rock bands of the day, constantly ensuring that there was never a dull moment for the home audience. Some behind-the-scenes accounts describe him as extremely hands-on, carefully vetting each act, orchestrating the lineup, and ensuring that no performance would run so long as to overshadow another. Being at the helm of such an operation for over 2 decades demanded both stamina and an uncanny ability to predict viewer tastes. In an era that witnessed seismic cultural shifts, from the relatively conservative Eisenhower years to the rebellious spirit of the late 1960s, he presided over the American living room throughout the civil rights era, the rise of rock and roll, Beatlemania, the counterculture movement, and the protests against the Vietnam War. The endurance of the Ed Sullivan Show, given these changing tides, speaks to Sullivan's adaptability and the gravitational pull he exerted in pop culture. But everything eventually comes to an end. Sullivan's personal story also contained moments of heartbreak and eventual decline. One might imagine that dedicating oneself to the rigors of a weekly live broadcast for over 20 years takes a toll, physically and emotionally. However, right up until his final days, Sullivan remained, in many ways, a restless presence, a man who never stopped wanting to put on the best show possible and to secure the biggest stars in the entertainment. He was complicated, kind-hearted at times, and combative at others, a mixture of tradition and quiet rebellion. He passed away on October 13, 1974, in New York City, leaving behind a legacy of entertainment in its purest form. He also left a void in Sunday night television that was never quite filled in the same way. At his passing, tributes poured in from the generations of performers who had found their big break, or at least a critical sliver of national exposure on his stage. It is difficult to overstate just how many careers he boosted over the course of his tenure. Whether one was an up-and-coming musician, a comedian looking for that big break, or a talented dancer eager to be discovered, The Ed Sullivan Show was an apex platform. Tom Smothers of the Smothers Brothers comedic duo once remarked that Ed Sullivan was a non-host, meaning he had no hidden motives or agendas. He was there to present the best of that era's talent in a straightforward manner that let them shine, rather than showcasing his own personality in some contrived or overbearing way. Some have called his life miserable or tragic in certain respects. He was known to be lonely despite his fame, always driven by the pressure to sustain ratings and to keep the audience's affection. The demands of constantly scouting and delivering the newest, most sensational acts might have deprived him of deeper, more personal relationships or simpler joys. And yet, if there was any tragedy, it lay perhaps in the tension between his private desires and his public duty. By the time of his death, he had become so integral to the phenomenon of television variety that it was nearly impossible to separate the man from his own creation. He had put so much of himself into the show, traveling, scouting, writing columns, forging alliances and rivalries across the entertainment world, that some say there was precious little left for him. Nevertheless, Ed Sullivan's name endures. Generations born long after he left the airwaves continue to hear about how the Beatles' big break on his stage was the milestone that launched Beatlemania in America. Elvis's appearances remain iconic, forever capturing the moment in which rock and roll found acceptance on a major mainstream TV platform. Comedy, too, was shaped by his benevolent or not-so-benevolent gatekeeping. Sullivan paved the way for comedic styles that would eventually evolve into the stand-up boom of later decades. His recognition of African-American artists signaled an important, if incomplete, shift in how entertainment respected the diverse array of talent present in the nation. Reflecting on Ed Sullivan's life, one finds a man who started from humble journalistic beginnings, witnessing the last remnants of a horse-drawn world transform into the age of the automobile, radio, and eventually television. He navigated fleeting jobs, overcame the collapse of newspapers, and learned from a master gossip columnist to reach for influence over the public's imagination. He endured sponsor uncertainties, overcame personal health challenges, developed a taste for the fast-lane lifestyle, feuded with show business peers, supported philanthropic causes, stood for racial equality when it counted most, and never lost sight of his mission to bring people together around a shared culture. For more than 2 decades, The Ed Sullivan Show was the definitive variety show, forging an unbreakable bond with viewers who planned their Sundays around his time slot. When Sullivan died, the television landscape was changing swiftly. The 1970s saw an explosion of more specialized TV content, the rise of late-night talk shows with comedic angles, and eventually the proliferation of cable channels and niche audiences. The variety show format, once so essential to network programming, waned as a new generation sought bolder, edgier, or more youth-oriented fare. Yet Sullivan's legacy continued to echo in the next wave of talk show hosts who also featured live performances, from Johnny Carson to David Letterman to others who filmed from the very same theater, renamed the Ed Sullivan Theater. One could argue that every time a new artist breaks onto the scene via a key television performance, the ghost of Ed Sullivan stands in the wings, nodding approvingly at the power of mass media to unify a country around a single, electrifying act. Even decades later, historians of television and pop culture continue to analyze Sullivan's unique ability to not only read the mood of America, but also to shape it. People ask themselves how much credit should go to Sullivan's own intuition, and how much was the result of the robust network machinery behind him. Yet nearly every personal account from those who worked with him or performed on his stage points to his unwavering dedication to producing a show that, more than anything else, delivered a full evening's worth of entertainment, be it comedic, musical, dramatic, or acrobatic. In an industry where so many hosts become the center of attention, Ed Sullivan dared to stand aside and let his guests sparkle, forging a distinctive rapport with America. The Ed Sullivan Show was more than just a variety program. It was a cultural institution that introduced Americans to phenomena as divergent as Elvis Presley and the Bolshoi Ballet, to comedic legends and novelty acts, to rock bands and Broadway extravaganzas. It is no exaggeration to say that for years you might miss church on a Sunday, but you would never miss Ed Sullivan. For those few precious hours, families found common ground in the collective excitement of seeing which act would surprise or delight them next. If anything, the tragic aspect might be that Sullivan rarely allowed himself the same measure of spontaneity and fun that he so willingly offered to the nation. Yet in the end, the personal complexities, the tensions, and even the feuds cannot negate what he accomplished: an unrivaled stretch of variety programming that shaped public memory for at least a generation. Observers who look back at old clips often discover how thoroughly he introduced acts that would go on to define entire musical or comedy eras, whether it was rock and roll, early stand-up, or even the building blocks of sketch comedy. Sullivan might not have been the funniest or the most polished host, but he was in many ways the most faithful steward of pure entertainment. So we bid farewell to Ed Sullivan, a legend whose stage opened up broader horizons for so many. Though his life had its share of miseries, spells of professional instability, conflicts with sponsors, and personal issues that were never fully resolved, he nevertheless ensured that countless others found joy and recognition. His death on October 13th, 1974, signaled not just the passing of an individual, but the conclusion of a golden chapter in television history. One can picture him walking away from the camera for the final time, leaving us with a mixture of gratitude and curiosity about what other wonders he might have unveiled had he been granted more years. In today's fragmented media world, perhaps the biggest tribute we can pay him is the recognition that once, not so long ago, a gentle, somewhat awkward man united a nation under a single spotlight, offering an improbable blend of circus acts, top-tier vocalists, comedic geniuses, and cultural phenomena, all lined up in the same evening. If you ever find yourself longing for an era when the whole country could gather to witness a new star's rise, look no further than the story of Ed Sullivan, the king of variety, whose sincere devotion to show business transcended every boundary, and whose influence still reverberates through entertainment today. And if you find yourself curious about what remains yet untold, rest assured there are endless anecdotes of behind-the-scenes drama, cultural collisions, and more feats of showmanship waiting to be rediscovered.